So, when we talk about what Oklahoma is like in this time period right after the 1920s, it's again a reflection of what's going on in the United States and vice versa. The United States is a reflection of what's going on in Oklahoma. So, the perfect way to start this is by explaining what's going on by talking about one individual in particular. Um, Looking at the oilmen and looking at what happens to the individual who puts all of his trust in this one natural resource that he is convinced is going to bring him all of this wealth, and there's going to be this endless amount of oil in the land, right? And this should sound familiar because there are plenty of people present day who are convinced that there is all of this supply of oil in the earth. And of course, we know that that's not the truth, right? But unfortunately, this is what's happening in the late 1920s, early 1930s. By the late 1920s, what starts to happen is there is so much uncontrolled production in the 1920s itself. There's so much uncontrolled production of oil in Oklahoma that eventually you are going to see this trend of oil wells drying up and drying up very quickly, to the extent that many oilmen are going to run out of money. The one example that stands out above all others is none other than Marland. So E.W. Marland is the probably the example that stands out the most, because he gets wealthy very, very quickly. And Marland is one of these guys who, if you ever look into him as an individual, he is one of these guys who you want to cheer for him, and you cheer for him because he genuinely wants to do well. And he not only wants to do well, he invests in his community and he gives back. So EW stands for Ernest Whitworth, in case you ever are interested in looking him up and doing more research into him. He drills his first well in 1911, and he establishes his headquarters in Ponca City, and establishes his business, Marland Oils. His wells pump thousands and thousands of barrels from several fields all throughout Oklahoma. He sells barrels to outside companies. And not only that, but he refines the oil himself. So he is making millions of dollars because not only does he have his own oil fields, he's also refining the oil himself. And then not only that, but he's producing gasoline himself, right? He's got his own filling stations on top of that. And so then what he decides to do is he invests in Ponca City. He builds the hospital in Ponca City. He builds the high school. He builds the library. He builds a golf course. He donates a polo field because evidently Ponca City wanted a polo field. He donates money to local churches, multiple denominations throughout Ponca City. Then he gives to the University of Oklahoma. He donates money to the university and buys them a student union, builds them an athletic stadium. So this is a guy who is incredibly generous with his money. He does not keep it all to himself. And then a few months after, while he's got all of his money, he builds this enormous, enormous mansion in 1928. He builds it, and it's finally completed in 1928. He moves in, and then a few months after, he and his wife move out. So they've only lived in it for a few months. They move out, and have to move into a studio that's been left behind by artisans and craftsmen who helped design and build his mansion, because what ends up happening is, um, all of his oil wells are bought out. Let me explain. He starts turning to Wall Street, specifically Wall Street bankers, and even more specifically, a guy that you should know, and you should be familiar with this name, a guy named J.P. Morgan. John P. Morgan was the wealthiest man in America. And not only was he the wealthiest, he was the most powerful and most influential man in America. He had the ear of every politician in Washington, D.C. He started turning to Wall Street bankers, and most especially Morgan, for loans. And he turned to them for loans because his oil wells were starting to dry up. So, of course, these bankers were more than willing to lend him money to keep him financially afloat. But here's the problem: what they demanded in return was that they would have representation on his company board of directors. So, in other words, it wasn't just that he would pay them back with interest. They wanted representation on his board of directors for his company. And eventually, what ends up happening is they had so much control of his board of directors, they had so much position, so many seats, that they ended up having control of the executive committee. And the executive committee ended up taking control of his company. So none of Marlin's ideas, none of Marlin's vision had any clout. None of Marlin's ideas for the future mattered. They ended up blocking all of Marlin's plans, and they ended up completely taking over. Um, Marland, for example, had an idea, um, of building a pipeline from Ponca City. He had a refinery in Ponca City. He wanted to build the refinery from Ponca City to the Texas Gulf Coast, but the board denied that request. And J.P. Morgan, who had essentially taken control of this board, because JP Morgan is the most powerful man in America. Um, after Marland had presented this plan, JP Morgan told his men on this board, "You need to get rid of Marland. We don't even need to hear his ideas anymore." They essentially said to Marland, "We need to remove you from this board." Uh, so Morgan's men combined this board with a different board in Colorado. And that Colorado firm, that Colorado board, was already under Morgan's control anyway. So, in other words, this company would combine with a Colorado oil company, and that would merge together and become yet another company under Morgan's control. So Marland Oils in Oklahoma merged with Continental in Colorado and became Conoco. Now, before Marland was kicked off, Marland was offered a deal. And the deal was, you can have a token position, a powerless position, where you can get a $75,000 a year salary on the condition that you live in Ponca City. So, in other words, you can stay on the board. You don't get a vote. You don't get any kind of say. You don't get to express your ideas, your opinions, your plans, your vision, nothing. But we'll pay you $75,000 a year. And to his credit, E.W. Marland said, "Screw you. Just take the board and go. And I'm going to do whatever I want." I'm, and he became unemployed instead. Now, just so you understand how bad things got for Marland, when Marland and his wife moved out of the mansion, the expansive mansion that they had built, he was so broke that he could not even afford to pay for the lighting bill, for the electricity bill every month. And the bill was like somewhere around $800 a month. He couldn't even pay for that. That's how bad things got. That's why he was so desperate for loans from these Wall Street bankers. That's why he's so desperate. That's what makes him ask for help. But I want you to understand how bad things get for Marlon. Now, by the way, if you were ever in Ponca City, you can go to the Marlon Mansion and you can take a tour of this brilliant, beautiful place and you can see it for yourself. But put a pin in E.W. Marlin because he is going to come back as he always does. But just so you know how bad things get, E.W. Marlin is just one example. In the 1920s and 30s, because of this oil production, oil is coming in record amounts. But here's the thing, if the oil wells aren't drying up, what these people are doing is they are flooding the market in and basically drowning the demand. And what happens, you guys know this from basic economics, when you are flooding the market with all of the supply, then you are essentially dropping its value, right? The value of oil drops precipitously. So the price of oil dropped to about 25 cents a barrel, and then at its lowest point, it dropped to about 10 cents a barrel. So the question became, okay, how are we going to respond to this? Because the price kept dropping. And then on top of that, these oil towns began to wither and dry out. So then these guys who kept moving into towns during the 1920s, these drilling crews, roughnecks, roustabouts, all of them had to leave because there was no work for them. And it was really just a terrible, terrible time for all of these guys. Because by then, you have uh, all of these drilling places that had just gotten completely out of control. And it's not just oil anymore, right? It's also agriculture. Agriculture is dealing with their own surplus issues. Surplus is showing up with cattle, with cotton, with corn and wheat. And because of that, the price of beef fell, the price of cotton fell, grain prices dropped, corn prices dropped. And on top of that, farmers ended up taking out new mortgages and they're sinking deeper into debt. And they, of course, cannot repay. One of the things that, if you check your US history textbooks, more often than not, they'll talk about this. But a lot of these farmers get really, really cocky during World War One, right? And they buy up all of this land, they buy up all of this new technology, they buy up all of these new tractors, and they are convinced that World War One is going to last for years and years and years. And of course, World War One ends in 1919. They buy all of this land, they buy all these new tractors, they build up these new barns, and they do it all on credit, right? They go to these banks and they get bad loans from these banks without any kind of backup for these loans. So in other words, it's as if you're going and getting these loans without the bank making sure that you are good to pay for it, right? A bank is not going to issue a loan to you without making sure that you've got a job that is paying you enough money that you can pay back that loan, right? Um, for farmers in the 19 teens, they're just giving these loans out, hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars worth of loans, and saying, oh, you're a farmer, here's thousands of dollars worth of loans, without making sure that these farmers are good for it. And so now these farmers are in massive amounts of debt, and they are getting, in the 1920s, second mortgages on their homes, second mortgages on their land, second mortgages on their barns, and they cannot pay it back. They are sinking deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. One of the things that I always tell my freshmen or my survey students is this: the Great Depression begins for the American farmer as soon as World War One is over. For most Americans, it begins in 1929, but for the American farmer, it begins in 1919, a full 10 years before the rest of the American people. Because of this, because they are not good for the loans that they took out. And that's the problem. One of the things that you have to understand, and you guys will read this in the essays or in the book on agrarian socialism. There is a prevalence of sharecropping and tenant farming in Oklahoma, particularly in the cotton belt of eastern Oklahoma. Um, when the price of cotton drops to a nickel a pound, it is particularly painful for these tenant farmers and sharecroppers. In Arizona, the advantage, if you can call it that, the advantage for Arizona farmers is that they at least, in most cases, owned their land, so they could at least, in many cases, cover the cost of production. So they're not going to make any profit, but at least they could cover the cost of production. In Oklahoma, however, 9 in 10 farmers, 9 out of 10 farmers in Oklahoma did not own his land. So a share of the crop left after paying their landlord's rent would almost never leave them with any kind of income. They would have nothing in their pockets. These people are living in abject poverty. They've got nothing. They have literally nothing. And they are not growing things out of the ground that they can consume, right? They are not growing something out of the ground that they can eat. They are growing something out of the ground that they have to sell. But what they are selling is not selling for any kind of real profit. And this is the great tragedy of this situation. When we talk about what makes this worse, what makes it even worse is their own contribution to this mess. So, when we talk about the Great Plowup, the Great Plowup is a new style of farming, a new technique of farming that was used starting in the 19 teens and going into the 1920s, that was designed to help farmers um, grow more from the ground. And of course, if you've lived in Oklahoma long enough, you know what the soil, particularly in central and western Oklahoma, is like. Especially if you're familiar with the climate here, you know that it just doesn't rain here very often. And you also know that the soil is dry. And so you are dependent on um, making sure that you plant at the right times and you plant just enough. You can't plant too much or you're going to lose out on a lot of seed. It's going to waste. So there's a new theory that comes up, and that is this idea that if you are willing to kill off the native grasses of Oklahoma and instead plant your seeds and pack it down with all of this soil, then use this technique of dry land farming, um, then pack that down with dust mulch, which is a thin layer of dust, so that you can protect the soil's moisture from evaporating. That will encourage your land to grow more of of wheat. And then you can use that to sell and make more make more profit. Now, here's the thing. These natural grasses are there for a reason, right? The natural grasses are there for a reason. They are there to protect the soil, they are there to protect the earth, and they are there to prevent. This is the most important part. They are there to prevent the dust of the earth from blowing around all over the place and um, destroying everything around it, right? Because Oklahoma is a very dry and windy place naturally. We are not prone to rainy seasons. We just aren't. Now, one of the things that happens in the 1920s is that over the course of a couple of years, there is an unnaturally rainy season. I'm going to say that again. There is an unnaturally rainy season. As a result of this unnaturally rainy season, for whatever reason, there are farmers who believe that, oh, this is a sign. We're going to use this to our advantage. We're going to plant all of this stuff. We're going to trap in all this moisture and we are going to plant all of these things. We're going to pack in the soil with the dust mulch. What happens as a result is instead of the moisture being packed in and all of this wheat growing and creating a brand new cycle, what happens is in the 1930s, things go back to normal. Uh, what happens is we don't get any rain. Oklahoma doesn't get any rain, especially in the western half of the state. And in fact, it's not just the western half of the state, it's the entire region of the southern plains. There is a drop in rainfall across the entire region, and many panhandle communities, not just in Oklahoma, but especially in Oklahoma and in Texas, uh, uh, all of them received no rain at all in the early 1930s. And as a result, you will get, all of this, not dust mulch, you get the Dust Bowl. Um, Oklahomans during the Dust Bowl are hit earlier and harder than the rest of the country and the rest of the Southern Plains, primarily because the center, what scientists determined when studying the Dust Bowl is that if you could have, when just like with an earthquake or even with a hurricane, they determine the center point of that earthquake, or with a hurricane, there is a center point of the Dust Bowl. The center point of the Dust Bowl was in the panhandle of Oklahoma. So when we talk about um, the heart of the Dust Bowl narrative, more often than not, people will refer to a group of the population known as the Okies. And I suppose people talk about the Okies because it's just the natural sort of reference from this story. So I want to talk about who they were, and how many people there actually were, in terms of the Okies. So Okies were Oklahomans who were driven off of the land um, because of the Dust Bowl. Um, so these were people who moved out of Oklahoma and sought new living and new working opportunities. And most of these people were moving out west. There were others who went out to other places. Some would go out east. Some would just leave the state and go live with their families who lived in other parts of the country. But these were Oklahomans who were just leaving the state of Oklahoma and seeking refuge in other places. Most of them are going out west and going to California because they believe that California was somehow some kind of promised land where there would be plenty of opportunities. These people are refugees. Think of them as refugees because that's exactly what they are. They are escaping this place where they can no longer live, they can no longer work, and they were seeking out a new life, seeking out new work opportunities somewhere else. Between 1930 and 1940, according to the 1930 and 1940 censuses, um, Oklahoma lost about 60,000 people. So um, there are quite a bit of people leaving. Now, are they leaving because of the Dust Bowl? That is it's not entirely certain, right? There are some people who were going to leave anyway. There were some people who died. There were some people who left because of the storm. So that's not entirely certain, right? Now, we do want to know who's leaving, and this is important. Some people are leaving because of the drought and because of all the dust. These things are really calamitous, right? The dust is getting into people's lungs, guys. They are breathing this stuff in, and it's causing people to die. They are suffocating and dying because of this stuff. They are coughing up their blood. They are choking on it. They are chewing on it in their food, what little food they have left. People are starving to death because nothing is growing from the ground. Here's the thing, all of this wind, all of this dust is blowing everywhere. People have to line their doors and their windows, and still the dust is coming in. They are walking around in inches of dust. It's everywhere. Sometimes the dust storms are so thick that you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. Um, there are stories of there's the story of Black Sunday. Black Sunday takes place where you could literally within 15 minutes, a dust storm comes in, and within 15 minutes, everything goes black because the clouds are so thick. So the dust gets into your food, it gets into your clothes, it grinds people's teeth down to the point where you no longer have teeth, and this is your adult teeth. um, uh, and it destroys the crops. It kills off the animals. I mean, what do you do when the only thing that grows out of the ground are beets? That means you eat beets, the cattle eat beets, horses, if they survive, they eat beet. Like literally everything is eating beets because that's the only thing that can grow. Um, it is absolutely devastating. Furthermore, you have the collapse of cotton tenancy. So those people who are tenant farmers and sharecroppers, they have to go because this was the only thing they knew how to grow cotton, and cotton is dead. Cotton is dead, and so they leave because there's nothing growing from the ground here. Um, One of the things that I want to make sure you understand is that a vast majority of of Oklahomans stay. Vast majority of Oklahomans stay, and the reason why they stay is because they can't afford to leave. They cannot afford to leave. So they have to stay because they've got no choice, right? They don't have um, the means to leave. They don't have a car. They don't have anything else that'll take them out. So they've got to stay, right? And there are others who refuse to leave because they have a love for the land. There are others who refuse to leave because they feel a moral obligation to stay, right? This is land that their grandfathers um, ran for and claimed, and they feel a responsibility for because they are the ones who packed the land with dust mulch, right? So there are stories of people who will literally go to church on Sunday and beg God for forgiveness because they think this is God's punishment for them. Um, the stories, the emotional stories that come out of the Dust Bowl are quite something. And I recommend that you watch Ken Burns' documentary on the Dust Bowl because you will hear of people talking about their experiences uh, as they grew up as children and teenagers, um, and experiencing what it was like to witness this, because many of them were actually scared that this really was um, a punishment from God. And then, of course, there's the great Woody Guthrie. Woody Guthrie, who was born in Oklahoma, born in Okima, Oklahoma, and then moved to Texas. He was alive and well during the Dust Bowl, then moved to California, and talked about the experience of the Okies, these people who moved to California as refugees and were rejected. This is the thing. They go to California seeking work and are treated as if they are terrible people who are stealing jobs from Native Californians. They are a burden to California society. In fact, California seeks out any and every opportunity to pass laws to keep to keep Okies out. In fact, there are signs in that are posted throughout California that will say things like Okies not allowed. So Okies and Black people are segregated against. Okies are rejected. Quite frankly, they face quite a bit of prejudice. And what's interesting about that, and quite frankly ironic, is they are facing the same level of prejudice that many of them exercise against Black people. It's so insane because they are going to California hoping for um, a chance to live. A life where they can work and live without fear of any kind of um, persecution. They're trying to escape and be free, escape the Dust Bowl, and they walk right into this kind of harassment. And of course, the fictional tale that tells the story the best, probably most famously, is John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. But Woody Guthrie talks about it quite a bit in his songwriting. He talks about what these working people go through as he tells the story of working people who go to California and see California as this place of promise, only to find that there is no promise there. Their story is interesting because um, when it comes to um, the Depression nationally, um, Republicans are punished, right? Because when you are when you have dominated politics nationally for an entire decade, like Republicans have, um, uh, Republicans being in charge, when things collapse, Republicans are going to be the ones to blame. Now, it didn't have to go that way. It did not have to go that way. The problem was, though, is that when you have a a president in charge when the economy collapses. Hang on. When you have a president in charge when the economy collapses, and uh, his move is to not really respond, or his move is to present himself as one who was only going to work for businesses and not for individual Americans, that's a problem. And the thing is Herbert Hoover is a guy who is intelligent. He is someone who knows how to work for and with charities. He is an incredibly capable man. Unfortunately, he just doesn't know how to present that as a president. And that's what works against him. And in his place comes Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt knows how to play the game. Roosevelt changes everything. And that's what paves the way for Democrats everywhere, except, of course, uh, except, of course, when it comes to Oklahoma. So, What's interesting here is that the tensions and disputes that formerly divided voters along party lines still remained, but they're all moving under the Democratic tent. So you're going to start to see more Black Americans voting for the Democratic candidate. Now, this is not everyone, not just yet. There are still Democrats who would vote for Herbert Hoover. However, um, as time goes on, as Franklin Roosevelt runs for reelection again and again and again and again, what makes the difference is his wife. His wife, Eleanor, is what's going to help cause the shift for the Democratic Party in winning over more African American support. And so will Harry Truman. That's what causes the big change. In Oklahoma, you have this guy, William Alfalfa Bill Murray. That's the Democrat who wins in Oklahoma. After his congressional career, um, here's the thing. I want to explain. Well, okay, let me go back for a second. So he, I don't know how to talk about him without making him a clown, but he is a clown. So let me just say this. So at 66 years old, he is the state's eighth governor. If you remember, he was the president of the state's constitutional convention. This guy is a thoroughly racist man. He was the speaker of the first legislature. He had run for Congress in 1916, and he lost. He had run for governor in 1918. He lost. Um, he went to Bolivia and then if you ask why, this is all true. He went to Bolivia in the 1920s and spent the 1920s trying to establish a colony that was centered around cotton. It failed, just like his, you know, congressional career and his uh, gubernatorial career. So he comes back to Oklahoma nearly penniless, and he decides he is going to run for governor again. But in order to file his um, file the campaign for governor, he had to pay for that. So he didn't have money for it. So he had to borrow money from the local bank. He had to borrow $29 from the local bank. He did not have $29. He had to borrow it. Guys, I cannot emphasize that enough. Okay, so his campaign. So he proposes his gubernatorial campaign by cutting costs. Um, he proposes to cut costs. Uh, One of his ideas to cut costs, like he says, okay, these are multiple ideas I have. One of his ideas is he will pardon any Oklahoma convict who promised to leave the state. So if you were convicted of any crime, then he would pardon you. So you can imagine how well that goes over with other states. Um, it shows you what kind of personality he has, right? It shows you the kind of personality he has, the kind of guy he is. He is a very crude personality. Um, he once threatened Kate Bernard, who was the one woman present at the Constitutional Convention, threatened to spit on her. You know, he's just a crude personality. But he's also a very calculated politician. And many liked that, at 66 years old, he's this aging, sort of pioneer type of person um, who put everything on this. Um, he was willing to put everything on the line, He's willing to try everything, even if he ends up going broke, which he did, right? He went to Bolivia and went broke. They like that he's willing to take risks like that, which, I think that's insane. But that's what Oklahoma's willing to do. Now, here's what ends up happening. He becomes governor and he makes good on that Oklahoma criminal promise. He pardoned and exported 2,214 criminals because we believe in quality here in Oklahoma. So he pardoned and exported 2,214 criminals. Um, in terms of his leadership, um, he did not really work with the state legislature. Instead, he used his executive declarations, and in fact, what he did was he declared martial law on the state. He, at one point, commanded the state militia to close bridges across the Red River because Texas kept challenging Oklahoma on where the border was. And rather than, challenge it legally and take it to the Supreme Court, he decided, by the way, allegedly he was a lawyer. He decided he was going to use the state militia. He also ordered National Guardsmen to shut down every producing oil well in Oklahoma, to end um, competition and to end overproduction, which, constitutionally, legally, you shouldn't be able to do, right? Because that would be a violation of executive authority. That would be something that even the Supreme Court would be like, no, you shouldn't be able to do that. Because if FDR can't do that, you definitely can't. But that's the kind of guy he is. When it comes to, speaking of FDR, when it comes to the New Deal, um, he does not support FDR. He does not support the New Deal. And this is the thing. Oklahoma overwhelmingly supported the New Deal. He is reticent. I mean, he does not support the New Deal at all. He resists every single New Deal program. In fact, Murray considered himself presidential material. He even tried in 1932, he even tried for the nomination, which I think is a part of the reason why he resists the New Deal. He believed he had a chance for the nomination, and he has a little bitterness against FDR, and a little bitterness that FDR won the nomination and not him. But the reality is he had no chance. He didn't have a chance in hell's bells against FDR. Um, so, just an example of why, one of the reasons why Murray hated FDR. FDR actually described him as being, and this is a direct quote, as crazy as a bed bug. Murray evidently heard that and hated FDR because of that. Well, that and a lot of other reasons. Um, After Murray's term in office, um, and well, don't call it a comeback. Here comes E.W. Marland. Marland actually becomes governor after Murray leaves. And here's the thing, this is a guy who does have a legitimate political background. In 1932, he decides to enter politics. So he becomes a politician the same year that FDR became president. He becomes a congressman. He won the 8th congressional district. He's the first Democrat to win. And his campaign slogan was "Bring the New Deal to Oklahoma." He's well educated. He's urbane. Of course, he's a one-time captain of industry, and people know who he is, right? So he is well known. He knows about Oklahoma. He's got a great reputation. He's someone who has invested in Oklahoma, but not only that, but he also knows about corruption. He knows what's been going on, how bad things have gotten. And once he's elected as governor, he becomes this guy who decides he's going to bring the New Deal to Oklahoma as governor, and essentially says, you know what, I'm going to bring my version of the New Deal and call it the Little New Deal. The thing is that the Little New Deal is expensive. It's really expensive. It would cost $500 million. That's the thing. The big New Deal, FDR's New Deal, is really expensive. And so is Marlin's. And the problem with Marlin's New Deal is that the state was already nearing bankruptcy. Um, and when you have a state that's already nearing bankruptcy, and then you've got E.W. Marland, who introduces this budget that is going to cost the state $500 million more dollars, that's really problematic. The legislature, which, by the way, was heavily Democratic, so it's not like he's clashing with Republicans. The Democratic legislature rejected it. And they're not only rejecting it because um, it's expensive, they're rejecting it because it's just like the Little New Deal, just like the other New Deal. If you think about FDR's New Deal, one of the things it does is it really centralizes the power of the presidency. It gives the presidency a lot of power. So does the Little New Deal. It gives the governor a lot of power, and the legislature doesn't like that. Not only that, but there's a lot of bureaucracy created with this Little New Deal. And they didn't like that as well. It's super ambitious, a lot of bureaucracy. And so he creates these programs, and they just don't really go anywhere. So he spends 4 years as governor, only to go back to Ponca City, and he sells his mansion. Now, the mansion was, $2.5 million um, to build. It cost him $2.5 million to build, uh, and he sold it just before he died. He dies in 1940. He sold it just before he died for $66,000. So it's a sad end to his life. Um, and but it tells you just how far things had gone for him. Now, we should talk about the impact of the New Deal. Um, Most Oklahomans want this New Deal. That's the thing. State leaders don't. State leaders are leery of the New Deal um, because of a few reasons. One, the the state economy is not doing great for multiple reasons. The the state economy is nearing bankruptcy already. Um, Furthermore, when we talk about leadership, you have to have leadership that knows how to budget, and they have yet to find leadership that can. That said, when it comes to different programs and how they work, um, there are some that actually have quite a bit of impact. The WPA, for example, got thousands of Oklahomans back to work building public projects such as local post offices and armories. In fact, I believe there are a couple of buildings on SWOSU's campus where you can actually see that there's a seal on it that on them that should say, like, a round seal that should say Works Progress Administration, or WPA. And there are buildings and sidewalks with seals like that in places like Oklahoma City and Norman and all throughout Oklahoma, with the Works Progress Administration's impact. There's also the impact and influence of the CCC, which employed young people to work in the forests of southeastern Oklahoma. You have, of course, the AAA. Um, the AAA is particularly important because this was an administration that had multiple federal programs that hoped to force commodity prices to go up, and they hope to do that by paying farmers to just completely slash their production. So, in areas where there was heavy tenancy, so if you were a farmer and you had multiple tenants working for you, um, you know, this was going to be particularly problematic because essentially these landlords were paid, but you were paid not to grow things. So these guys pocketed the money, didn't give any to their tenant farmers, and then dismissed their tenants. That's the problem. So these tenant farmers were totally screwed over. The guys who owned the land kept the money. Their tenant farmers didn't get anything. The land didn't grow anything. And that really sucks because the people who could have used the food didn't get any food. The tenant farmers who could have used the money didn't get any money. So it really screws them over. Um, and then, what makes it even worse is these landowners would then invest their savings and buy new equipment. Like they would buy tractors, and they would buy other equipment so that they wouldn't have to hire these tenant farmers again. So in other words, these tenant farmers were left out in the cold because the landowners didn't need the tenant farmers anymore. So this program was really, really problematic. Okay. There was also, of course, the cornerstone, the most important program of the New Deal, and that's the Social Security Act. And the Social Security Act, um, tens of thousands benefited from immediate relief measures, and of course, the future promise of a more secure old age. Um, okay. Now, not everybody is going to fully embrace the New Deal, even if they're a Democrat, right? And you don't have to be as crazy as a bedbug like Alfalfa Bill Murray is. This is Leon Phillips. Leon Phillips is a conservative Democrat who was elected governor in 1938. And Phillips was, you know, Phillips was one of these guys who not only did not support the New Deal measures, he believed that the New Deal measures were an overextension of federal power. And he believed that he had a responsibility to take a stand against this federal overextension. He at one point declared martial law. These guys in martial law, man, it is deep and real. He called out the National Guard to prevent the federal government from constructing dams and water projects. He called them out twice. This happens with Lake Texoma and Grand Lake. And it gets so bad that the Supreme Court had to force him to stand down. Um, it's really problematic. Now, where he is successful is he prevents the state from going further into debt, right? Let me go back here. He prevents the state from further into debt, which is really what the goal is. His issue is trying to make sure that the state is managing its money well. And in 1932, he pushed through this balanced budget amendment. And it changed the state constitution to forbid the government from appropriating funds in excess of its tax collections. In other words, you cannot spend more than what you collect. You cannot spend more than what you collect in terms of tax collections. Now, Provisions have been amended several times since then, but the amendment remains in the Constitution. The amendment is still there. So it shows his impact. But the guy who has probably been the most influential of the time period is Robert Kerr. Robert Kerr was born in a log cabin outside of Ada. A log cabin that is real. He is a guy who is quite smart. This is someone who uh, gets a 12th grade education, becomes a teacher, and uses his very, very small salary to pay for a 2-year correspondence degree that he gets from a teeny tiny state college that we now know as East Central University. Um, then he goes to law school at OU. He had to borrow $350 to do it, but he does it. After a year, he runs out of money, and that's the end of his education. By then, World War One begins, so he serves in the war. He comes back to Ada, gets married. He opens a grocery store. Um, his wife is pregnant with twins. The twin daughters, they die at birth. And then his wife gets pregnant again with a baby boy. Um, th- uh, During childbirth, the baby boy dies, and then his wife dies. Then um, a fire destroys his grocery store, and he is now $10,000 in debt. Can you imagine? So his twin daughters die at childbirth. His wife becomes pregnant with another child. When she's in labor with the child, they both end up dying during labor, and then his business gets on fire and it's all destroyed, and now he's $10,000 in debt. Then what he does is he goes back to law school. He passes the bar exam in 1922, opens a legal office in Ada. He marries again. He marries the daughter of a wealthy oilman in Tulsa and decides to go into the oil business like you do. And he moves to Oklahoma City. He, getting into the oil business, he hires a geologist, an expert geologist named Dean McGee. Um, Dean McGee, MC capital GEE. Dean McGee used to work for Phillips Petroleum, and Kerr convinces McGee to start working for him instead. And the two of them become partners. They launch a series of companies that eventually become an industrial giant that you may have heard of called Kerr McGee. They've earned they earn millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. And Kerr decides to transition into a life of politics in the 1930s, and he believes it's time to make his move. He's appointed to a series of state positions for the Democratic Party. By 1940, he's on the Democratic National Committee. By 1942, he is governor of Oklahoma. 1942. When we talk about 1942, what's important is over the course of his time in the 1930s and getting onto the Democratic National Committee, and by 1942 becoming the governor, Kerr has developed some very important relationships. And we're not talking about relationships with other governors or other congressmen or things like that. We're talking about relationships with Franklin Roosevelt. We are talking about relationships with incredibly powerful and influential people at the Capitol, in Congress, in the Senate, and Franklin Roosevelt, and the Pentagon. And that's going to be incredibly important because during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, of course, is going to call for an increase in military spending. And military spending multiplied several times over after the attack on Pearl Harbor, right? Billions of dollars were spent on raising troops, training for combat, equipping them with weapons, all of that stuff. So, because Robert Kerr had spent all of those years prior to the war cultivating these relationships with the White House, with members of Congress, members of Senate, members of the Pentagon, what he does is he calls on favors, and he ends up bringing in a flood of federal dollars into Oklahoma. And this is what you need to know. Because of Robert Kerr, there were 28 military installations brought into Oklahoma, including Fort Sill, Tinker Air Force Base. All of these military installations are because of him. There are 13 naval bases. 13 naval bases brought to Oklahoma. Naval bases brought to Oklahoma. Air bases consumed miles and miles of poor farmland and put thousands and thousands of people back to work. So farmland that had lost its usage, farmland um, that had been essentially retired altogether, had now been put to use for the federal government. British and Canadian pilots were trained in Ponca City and in Miami. In fact, there were POW camps that were located in Oklahoma. These POW camps were used for Germans for the most part. That's because of Robert Kerr. That's because of him. He's the guy who's making the difference. Robert Kerr serves during his political career, will become a senator at one point. During that time, because he's a senator, this is what he's doing. He's cultivating relationships, and as a result of that, he is able to bring in that federal money, and that relationship right there changes who will be the largest employer in Oklahoma. From that point to now, the largest employer in Oklahoma is the federal government. So keep that in mind. Now, on that note, let's talk about Oklahomans in World War II. When it comes to serving in the war, just like everywhere else, you can see Oklahomans everywhere. But in particular, I do want to emphasize the 45th Infantry Division. Now, just so you know, in Oklahoma City, if you haven't visited it yet, you should. There is a museum dedicated to the 45th. It is worth it. And if you do go visit it, please donate to it because it's worth the donation and it's worth the visit. So, just so you understand, 200,000 Oklahomans volunteered for military service, and then another 300,000 were drafted into uniform. So we had a total of 500,000 Oklahomans serving during World War II. And when it comes to the 45th Division, um, the history of the 45th is very long. So originally, it was organized as a territorial militia in 1890. So it's been around as long as there was Oklahoma Territory. Okay, so the 45th Division has been around as long as the territory. Um, the Spanish American War, when it begins, Oklahomans, including troops from Indian Territory, combined with the New Mexico militia, meaning the territory of New Mexico, as well as the Arizona Territory, and together they formed Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. So the 45th is a part of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders during the Spanish American War. These are the guys who went with Teddy Roosevelt to fight in the Spanish American War. During World War One, the 45th joined with the Texas National Guard and served in Europe. After World War One, they reorganized, and that's when they became the new 45th. And they were based in Oklahoma City. And so the new 45th, as we know them now, they draw upon the National Guards from Oklahoma, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. So that's essentially where the 45th comes from. Now, during peacetime, these guys would come together and primarily train during the summers. And in World War II, when we talk about their service, um, they by 1943 they were primarily fighting in North Africa, Sicily, and Anzio. And then by the end of the war, these were the guys who were in Munich. Um, Total fighting during World War II, they fought 551 days. These were the men who liberated prisoners at the concentration camp of Dachau. Um, it's an incredible legacy that they carry. And so, if you go to their museum, you will actually see, and in fact, I think they still have on display um, a mirror that Hitler had. They were able to take it, and they have it on display there. They have a tremendous collection, and it's absolutely worth visiting. Um, this is, of course, how the country gets out of the Great Depression, but it's also a tremendous legacy for the state of Oklahoma.